the last time. Thank you. And so we're going to cover that. And then we're going to go to some new applications. And as we did the last time, I'd like to give everybody some opportunity to kind of percolate in groups and see how this would work for their own institutions and just really kind of talk about application. Again, if you have any questions or comments, I'd like to make this as conversational as possible, although I have, some organization in a PowerPoint. I'll mention Joni Scritchlow is not able to join us today, but is just enthusiastic about where this is going. I shared the PowerPoint with her and she's like, oh, we're really in deep now. I'm like, yes. So that's my preface for today. We're really in deep now in terms of processes, opportunities, some of the things that we'll talk about at our next meeting. And it's I think, a pretty meaty discussion point that I think there'd be some benefit to are coming to some general consensus around it is the assignment of credit hours for competencies. I know that this is something that has bubbled up in other state groups that are working this summer. And I think that the more perspectives that we can generate and share, the more that will ensure continuity and the more that we can support student transfer, articulation, continuity and assignment of credentials, all of those factors. So good morning. It is so nice to see everyone. And with that, I will just jump in with the PowerPoint. Does anybody have any questions starting off? Okay, let me pull up the PowerPoint. And I am assuming everyone can see this. And I am just reminding, for whatever reason, once I hit play slideshow, I can no longer see chat, etc. I can't see everybody on the screen. So please, again, if you have a comment or a question, just jump in, or Stephanie, if you could just let me know if a chat question comes through, I'd be like super grateful for that. So
yeah, will do.
Thank you so much. So we've talked about the idea of syllabi deconstruction. And as I mentioned, I've sent out that follow-up video that really just kind of went through an example of syllabi deconstruction. Today, we're going to focus on syllabi reconstruction. And I have a handout that I think will be helpful to you in that process. One of the things I thought about is that it might be of some benefit, I'm going to share the handout today, but that it would likely be of benefit to share it with everyone after the meeting. So if it needs any adaptations based on our conversation, you have the most current version and don't have to percolate on, was this set up before the meeting or after the meeting? So one of the things that we had talked about last week that I think is a pretty foundational and fundamental aspect of modularizing courses, just in terms of layout, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that competencies within courses should encompass all of your content. And so if we think about that process that we went through as a state in 2015, 2016, the idea that our benchmarks were aligned to content, and then when we move to competencies, it should be still all inclusive of the content in your course. So if you have competencies and information that doesn't align, you'll likely want to percolate on that a little bit. Like, what is the origin of that additional information? And there might be some very valid reason, but I think taking a step to reflect and pause on that is time well spent. Another factor to keep in mind, competencies should only be generally represented once in your program of study. And so if they are repeated continuously, again, the opportunity to consider origin. Why is that? And I just want to state that in our movement to competencies, one of the things that was intentionally decided is that, as you know, the competencies are leveled, and we have competencies that align not only to skills, but to measurable knowledge. And within the context of each of those competencies, this is where this information is developed as well as assessed. So introduced, developed, and assessed. So the idea that that competency needs to be attained prior to moving on to additional levels of knowledge and skill. So the other thing that we've talked about a lot, and again, this is review, but points of discussion if needed as well, is that there are contextual factors that are very influential in modularizing syllabi. Those are your own institutional needs, the needs of your learners, the existing state system. And one of the things that we've spent time talking about is like those important touch points that kind of influence how competencies may be arranged. So important touch points include pathways that exist within the state. For example, the CDA, they include things such as IAI. They include things such as the leveling and articulation and opportunities that exist connected to Smart Start, just to name a few factors that are influential. And that we're thinking about competencies as an organizational tool, and we can use all kinds of different organizational tools, right? We could use the NACCE standards as an organizational tool and extract that way, or the NACCE competencies. We can use the learning outcomes within our course. But in this case, to modularize by level, that lens that we're using is to extract and reconstruct are those NACCE competencies. So I'm going to pause for a minute and ask if there are comments, questions, insights, or clarifications that anybody wants to share about any of that information. Okay. Hearing none. So this slide we talked about last time, and I added a couple clarifying points because I think that this is important, and that when we get to our next meeting, when we're really talking about implications, that this is really essential factors to consider. So these 4 examples are from child growth and development syllabi in Illinois. So I took what competencies were aligned at different colleges and universities around the state and came up with 4 different examples. That last example, example 4, is, there are many syllabi that are arranged this way, and that also reflects the IAI competencies that are embedded in child growth and development. So child growth and development goes all the way from level 2 through level 5. One of the things that I think is super interesting about this slide, and I'm just going to ask for commentary. I'm going to share some of the things that I think are interesting, include that, you see that first example, and it has those first 3 competencies, those level 2 competencies, and it's one course that is 3 credit hours that is child growth and development. If you look at that second example, it's 2 competencies that are the same course. If you look at the third example, we can see that there is 1 competency added. And then in that 4th example, there are all of those competencies that are embedded, those 6 competencies that are embedded within the exact same course. So I think that this has some interesting implications. Like if you were thinking about modularization, for example, the idea that that first course pretty well appears to be a level 2 course that's already kind of modularized, right? But there's no parent that has all those 6 competencies for articulation. So one of the things that I think is worthy of a discussion, and we'll get into this a little bit more next week, is that idea of continuity across systems. So many students, many learners engaged in these pathways would all get credit, 3 hours of credit for the same course, but there's a lot of variance in the content that's included within each of those courses. So I just wanted to pause for a minute and see if anybody has any comments about that, or commentary about really diving into this a little bit next week when we think about like state implications, if you feel like that's worth our time, etc. So please fire away if you have comments.
Yeah, this is like the biggest. I mean, I'm really appreciative that you used an IAI class, because we have access to so few of them in our state for early childhood, right? And I think this is where my thinking has been going, is that if we're going to push on an external system, the IAI is the place to go, because it codifies the transfer protections for students in no matter which institution they're transferring from, right? And this is a really good example of why we need to use IAI, because there's really, really good design reasons and really good transfer protections that lead you to design your program either way, right? Either laterally by level, which would mean that these courses would not contain all human growth and development, right? They would contain all level 2 competencies, or by subject area like this, right? And IAI kind of protects us more in the subject area, because it is related to the specific outcomes that are related to the course. And if we're thinking about this model, then like we all need to be thinking about design differently, because with the idea being that this would be a human growth and development course that would transfer for all human growth and development competencies up to the level 5, regardless of where it was taken right now. Like, not only do we have to push on IAI to get the competencies into the description of the course, right, on the level that they've approved it, but we also have to be thinking about right now, community colleges aren't able to show evidence in the INCRA system that they cover the level 5 competencies, right? So like there's all kinds of like systems work that has to be done to make this work. And we're not really building. My big question becomes, because there's a good reason for doing it both ways, either doing it by level or doing it by subject area, how standardized do we want to be as a state in that design process?
I think that's an excellent question. And I think that that's something that, you know, and all of that was so well said. And I think that that is something that we could spend some time on, because that percolating of how one does this does have a lot of implications. Other comments or reactions to that, what Leslie just shared? I'm not hearing any. And so again, this is going to be some of the meat that we spend some time on, and how much time will be determined by the committee. I will share, as I've mentioned before, that the way we elected to modularize that child growth and development course at Heartland was that we isolated, and we're going to talk a lot about parent courses and child courses. And you might think that's not the best acronym for this. That's all I could think of. And so I'm open to alternative suggestions. But the parent course is all of those competencies, the HGD 1 through 6, and then we isolated 2 child courses, one with the level 2 competencies. And in that respect, we could, as I've mentioned before, remove the English prerequisites, so that students who were enrolled developing their literacy skills could enroll in those level 2 competencies. And then the other child course holds the remaining competencies at 2 levels. Another option could be, there's so many ways to do this. I'm just sharing how we did it. One could have the parent course and then 6 child courses. You could have 3 that are arranged by level, and I have those levels and the color coding included below. So there are lots, I think, of options if, and I think you said this so well, Leslie, if we decided to use that original IAI as the organizing strategy. And the idea of continuously referring to IAI, I agree, is beneficial, because that's where we've had such incredible statewide consensus that secures transfer. So with that said, just, a little bit again on that process that we've talked about, you identify the placement of competencies in courses, you determine the content that's aligned with the course, and then you kind of determine and reflect on external alignment that has these influential factors related to arrangement. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about just pausing again on the deconstruction process. And again, I, prompted earlier that idea that if you take competency in that far left column, and that's what you modify, and then you place all your content, that's one way to determine here's the competency and here's all the content that aligns with it. And just, I feel like going through that organizational structure can be really beneficial to have it all horizontally lined out, because on a syllabus, as you know, it's lined out in a very vertical fashion with things in different sections. So I think it's a useful organizational tool. I'll ask, did anybody, we had talked about a sample syllabi to start with, and that ideally you could move to additional syllabi, but did anybody engage in this process over the past 2 weeks and have anything they want to share about going through it? No exciting comments about, was it like watching season 2 of The Bear completing this, which I will highly recommend if any of you haven't seen it. But so maybe the syllabi deconstruction worksheet wasn't quite like that, but possibly close. So
One thing, because I
yeah.
was lucky enough to join NLU after much of this work had been done. They kind of done all the hard stuff for me, right? But we have been going back for courses that we developed as, we're doing it like the opposite way, like develop the competency-based course and now trying to like restructure the syllabi to meet a course that was designed from get to only have the competencies in it. And something that we found out very quickly is that it affected our classroom policies, and that we had to rewrite all of our classroom policies to be specific to the competency-based format.
Oh, okay. So Leslie, give me a couple examples of that. So classroom policies in terms of moving towards a CBE model.
Yes, because when we modularized it, it became apparent that there was no real reason to give them an order to do the modules in or due dates, right? Because it's like, it's modularized content. Why would we put artificial constraints on top of when and how you do the modules? And then it was like, well, if we don't have due dates, like half of our student policies are related to due dates, incomplete, late work, attendance, like all of these. And so we had to really go back to the drawing board with those kind of things.
That's really interesting and a great point. And that's very much reflective of a full CBE model. And so, yeah, thank you for saying that. That would be a good thing to add in terms of just thinking about like that last workshop where we talk about learning pathways, what are the implications for how you do this for learning pathways? So thank you for sharing that, and related course policies. So in terms of next steps, so we're going to have time again to work in groups, and the idea of looking at your initial syllabi deconstruction workshop, which is organized by syllabi, maybe you just started with one, and really thinking about what opportunities for modularization exist and what kind of factors are going to influence how you engage in this work. And so, there are a lot of opportunities around clarifying credential pathways. And so some organization by level, for example, the opportunities that exist for universities to credential down. So if you have this arranged in a way where it really makes that opportunities for earning credentials visible at each aspect of the learner pathway. And people were sharing with me, strategies that they already have in place last week. So the idea that people will, at the end of every semester or every year, turning in their syllabi or their coursework to gateways to see what credentials that they've attained. So having processes that reflect that, but then the opportunity to have pathways that kind of clarify that as well. And then again, returning to those external factors that impact credentialing by level. And so again, that's opportunities around Smart Start, that's opportunities for wage scale with people earn their level 2. There's all kinds of factors related to students stopping out and having those credentials to support their progression and the ability for them to easily come back in should they rejoin or when they rejoin their educational journey. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about this reconstruction process. And again, I mentioned that, I'm talking about those parent syllabus and those child syllabus. And that the decisions you make around modularization very much impact how you reconstruct courses. And so just thinking about what those influencing factors are. And one of the things to keep in mind is that if you modularize a course, you have to make sure that the learning pathway, this child learning pathway, is reflective of that parent syllabus if you are keeping a parent syllabus. But even if you're removing the parent syllabus and just going full modularized courses, you want to make sure that the learning journey covers all the required content. And we talked that first week about all those various factors that go into that syllabus. So for transfer purposes, if you are at a community college and elect to make 2 child syllabi, just in the context of this example, they together need to mirror that parent syllabus. And so I just want to talk through a couple of these components. So that child 1 syllabus, that green syllabus on the left bottom, is duplicative of part of that parent syllabus. The child 2 syllabus is duplicative of another part of that, a unique part of that parent syllabus. And that child 1 plus child 2 syllabus is equal to that parent syllabus. And I'll just pause for a moment, and then I love your commentary. One of the reasons, like at Heartland, we elected to keep that parent syllabus. We have one particular pathway where we have a lot of learners who are entering from high school or soon after and are engaged in very much what we consider our traditional course format. And so we created this alternative course format comprised of these child syllabi to support the incumbent workforce, learners who had experience, to more easily encompass opportunities for prior learning, incorporation of the CDA, et cetera. So comments or questions, insights from your own institutions, what are people's reactions?
So I have a question, and of course I'm newer to the field of higher ed. I've only been doing like curriculum work in higher ed for 2 years now. So this may be a stupid question, but so as I think about the parent syllabus, the child syllabus, this all makes perfect sense, and I can see how I could take my level 2s and my level 3s, my level maybe 4 and 5, and modularize that within the course. Is there any reason, or could this be done in a way that this becomes my child course actually becomes a variable credit course, to where my students could just take the components that they needed to finish up, that credential, and then we just award them how much we've designated for each module within that. So it's almost like I'm duplicating the course in that modularized format, but that child course is variable, whereas my parent course is a set 3 credit hours the way I normally run it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a question I have regarding, and during that first workshop, that idea of variable credit and what it means in the context of modularization, I think is a tricky one. And so thank you so much for bringing it up. So are you saying that if you have your level 2 competencies isolated, for example, in a child course, and a learner only let's say there are 3 competencies in a particular example, but a learner only needs 2 of those competencies, that's the case that you would assign variable credit?
I was thinking, I was thinking more like maybe I have someone who has, done some type of PLA, and they have the, like a level 2 and a level 3, but they really haven't got that level 4. So then they could take that class for variable credit, achieve like my level 4 and 5, so that I can then give them credit for, they're in essence getting credit for the whole course then at that point.
And so I think, so let's just pretend, for example, that and I'm asking this as a clarifying question, you've isolated competencies at level 2, you've isolated competencies at level 3, and you have a learner that needs these isolated modularized competencies at level 4. If they've earned PLA, or if they don't need those first 2 sets of competencies, those would transfer in for whatever process that you have. And so, maybe they'd get credit for that. If you have credit recognition through PLA, maybe that would just be recognized. And so I think what's confusing about the term variable credit to me is that if this is 1 credit hour, this is 1 credit hour, and they've earned that versus other pathways, they only need that 4th component, which is worth 1 credit hour because you've assigned 1 credit hour to it. And I think the variable credit is sometimes used like bundling competencies within a course that, well, they only need these pathways, which can get into financial aid implications. So the idea of modularizing it and like this level 4 is worth 1 credit hour. I think it's worth 1 credit hour, and they've either earned these other 2 or they're recognized on their transcript. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Other comments about that? Because I think this variable credit, I think it's so, it's one of those, I think there's benefit to clarifying around that, and clarifying for me too, what is meant by it. And it seemed like that made sense in the context of your example. But other comments about variable credit, and did that conversation kind of, I don't know, comments or reactions? I want to make sure.
I think the variable credit makes sense to me when you don't know what you're going to be giving credit for in advance, right? To Jana's point, like if you have, that you have students, you have your courses aligned up to the level 4, right? But you have a group of students that are coming to you that are only going to have a level 3, then you can very succinctly put what are the gap competencies into a specific course, PLA opportunity of your own, summative assessment, whatever it might be, and then assign that the amount of credit hours that it deserves, depending on however you calculate credit hour compliance at your institution. The way that we've been thinking about variable credit is like, I don't know what a student's going to come with because of the training hours, right? A student might come to me with a level 3 plus FCR 5 and health, safety, and well-being 6, but not everything that's for the level 4, right? So now I have 3 or 4 competencies that I want to I have those 2 competencies that I want to give them credit for that don't necessarily add up to a course. Now that's like a little bit more of how we're thinking about variable credit. To Jana's point, you got to be real careful about double dipping, right? You can't give them variable credit for a course that you're going to give them actual credit for on the transcript later. And then the other financial aid side of that is that if your SAP policy at your institution is using enrollment credit hours to calculate SAP, you can put students in a really bad situation if they're just taking a credit here and a credit there, right? Because they're going to violate your internal SAP policy. So you would need to intentionally like enroll them in a course that was enough credits for them to maintain SAP, and then have them working on this like 1 or 2 credit opportunity simultaneously, which may or may not be the best choice for them. what we're trying to take through our curriculum process right now is a special topics course that is variable credit. So that what that allows me to do is if the student comes to me with credit and I don't have a matching course in my system, I can assign not only the topic of the course, but also the amount of credits that should be relevant to the amount of work that they did without having to know in advance what type of credit they're going to bring to me. And then that counts as an elective for graduation, right? For things that I don't have a good course match for.
I just want to say that example was very clarifying to me in that, so, and I think when we talk about variable credit and modularization, they're two distinct things. So modularization is assigning of credit, and then variable credit is, and I think that example of, and I'm sorry, I can't remember, you just said the word a minute ago, but you know, in my mind, I replaced it with independent study. And so that's what I'm kind of thinking right now, but you had used a different term and I apologize that, you know, my brain overrode it. Where it's kind of a unique course composition that's variable credit based on individual needs. So modularization, specific application of credit, and then this more flexible learner pathway that includes, and one reason why I think that's important is on an independent study, it might not all, or I'm sorry, can you say again, Leslie, the term you used?
Yeah, it's like we're using it as an independent study. We're using it for transfer credit for things where we don't have a place for it. So like one example that came up is I had a student that came to us with gorgeous early childhood work that was all Canadian. And the topics of her courses were very specific to Canadian early childhood delivery systems. We want to give her credit for that, but I can't necessarily find a course match in my existing courses, right? That's going to have those learning outcomes because it was so specific to the context of where she had taken the courses. Yeah. The other thing that we see a lot is like, is that if a student has taken an AA degree with some early childhood credit and has done some training hours at work, they're going to have a level 2 or 3 plus some other stuff. And there's no way for us to know what that other stuff is, but we want to give them college credit for it, right? So
right. And so, and I remember you said special topics, right?
Special topics is what we listed it as. Yeah.
And so the idea that, and I think that that's a incredibly flexible and responsive process for unique student needs. And then at the same time, the benefit of modularization with assigned credit is that those special topics or independent studies might not be as transparent for transfer purposes, right? And but then what a important add-on to meet all those unique learner pathways and combinations that come along. So kind of separate and distinct. Is that, and I am very appreciative of the clarifying conversation. Is everybody comfortable with other comments?
I just have one quick question then, Leslie. How then for transcript purposes, when individuals send those to us, how would gateways, or how would we know what credit or what competencies were covered in those special topics, since it's so individualized to the person?
So you wouldn't need to look at the course, right? Because we would be entitled for the level 5. So assuming that person completed the entire degree program, you would only be looking at graduation. Now, if that person came to us, took that course and stopped out, right? That is a totally different situation. Like, would you be able to give them a credential? And our solution to that currently is that the way our registrar system works, and it's not going to be the case for all of them, is that when we open the special topics course, it allows us to add a subtopic to the course. So if the subtopic was a specific competency, we would put that. If the subtopic was like level 3, we would put that. If the subtopic was early childhood international studies or independent study or something like that, we would list that. But it really depends on how your registrar prints transcripts.
And then that subtitle shows up then on the transcript, like underneath it as a topic? Okay.
And that sounds like a great process. Stephanie, I think your question about, how would we recognize this relating to transparency? And I think what you described, Leslie, is one way for it to show up on the transcript, because otherwise, we're looking at syllabi, which is another way too, as long as it's listed on the syllabi. I mean, that's the way we've operated for a while, in absence of things like statewide use of badging, for example. Those are kind of alternative processes. So thank you. Other comments? Okay, so some of the implications for, I wanted to make sure I did that correctly, and I did, implications for assessment. And so I wanted to talk briefly about assessment and learning pathways, which we're going to dive into a little bit more deeply. So if we're thinking about, here's all the related content that we have aligned to a competency, and content in this case is the content of a syllabus. How does this inform assessment and the learning pathway? And, ideally, we think about backward design in terms of, sorry, I have to make an adjustment. I'm at my daughter's, and so I have she's a college student, so my computer is set up on a really precarious folding chair, which almost completely collapsed. So ideally, we think about within the context of our classes, and I'll send some resources related to this, that we start with what are the desired results? What is it that we want students to know and be able to do? And that informs acceptable evidence, how we would specifically demonstrate that, and then learning experience and instruction, that idea of what are the desired results. And I think we can very much mirror that process with syllabi development when we think about assessment and learning pathways. So what is it in the context of this syllabus that we are saying learners are going to be able to know, demonstrate that they know and are able to do? And how does that inform everything we do in the context of the course? And I think that, I think that this is something that makes sense, right? That we all think about this, but at the same time, we've been going through this kind of rigorous process at Heartland, looking at early childhood across the gen ed curriculum. And, the idea that, well, but that's my favorite assignment. I love that assignment. Students love that assignment, but why is it in the course, right? Like there might be like universal joy around it, but if it's not tied to something that they know and are able to do, maybe meld that joy into something that is directly related. And so I think that we can think about that in terms of not only design of assessments, but also the syllabus, as I said. And I think that backward design is just a really useful strategy for kind of conceptualizing that. And as I said, I'll send out some resources related to that afterwards. I'm going to pause again and ask if there are any comments or questions. Okay, hearing none. So when we think about, again, those child syllabi, and please, if you have a better analogy, so open to better analogies, thinking about, first of all, what competencies inform modularized syllabi. So an important check is ensuring that all competencies from child modularized syllabi map into the parent course. Again, we want to really think about that in the context of transfer overall. And thinking about too, is there really a good reason that's informing how you've created the child syllabi? And so, in the first workshop where we met, I mentioned that, if I had this to do all over again, and, long term, I still might do it. I might modularize every single competency, but I truly believe that it would have just been too much system stress in terms of change, and that the way we did it was a good reason that was reflective of internal contextual environments within our own institution. And I just say, we had a lot of retirements, a lot of people who were new, just a lot of, here we're trying to do something new, what's going to be most effective. So what is the substantive reason or the variety of reasons that are informing how you've created the child syllabi? And you might elect different things. I'm just going to isolate by level 2. I'm going to isolate by level 3, or not level 3, by all the different levels. And that's going to be informed by your learners as well as, your unique institutional needs, but you always want to take that context into account. So what content identifies to aligned competencies is another relevant factor. You want to make sure that you include all required syllabi components when that child course, and you want to make sure that that content is reflective of identified competencies. So are the assessments and learning journeys supportive of attainment of those competencies? And if there's additional content, to again think about the origin, to put that check into place, so to speak. Comments about that? Okay, I'm going to show you a model. So we've gone through, this looks an awful lot like the reconstruction worksheet, right? And this is a construction. So you are just taking everything that you have done in terms of deconstructing your course and organizing it. A couple things that are different. One of the things that I found challenging when we went through the process, it is it's all housed in the context of your computer, but it's like organizing a really messy closet, I felt like. So the idea of continuously, what was the original course placement? And as I mentioned before, there might be better ways to organize this. And if people have found some, to please share them with the committee, because I know all our brains work in unique ways. And so the idea, the more models we have, the more likely we are to find one that works for us. But I think that idea of always tracking where you took something from, where it came from, looking at, again, the learning objectives or learning outcomes, the portion, as we talked about, whatever that portion of the course description is relevant, and constantly checking, is that encompassing of whatever competencies I've put in there, the learning resources that are relevant, the range of assessment methods, and for whatever reason, I can't see that last column because I can't move the people I can see on the screen over. So again, this is just a process of taking the syllabi apart and then thinking about how it fits together or how it might fit in child courses, which again is something that you might want to loop and revisit continuously. I'll pause for comments or questions or insights. Has anybody adapted the original sheet in a way that they found beneficial? Okay, and this is a resource I will share and send out afterwards. And then just a variety of different resources to support your work before we go into groups and kind of pull this apart a little and then talk a little bit as a broader group. Again, I kept a lot of the resources that we had originally and then added the ECE toolbox. You'll receive a copy of this as well. The toolbox, as you know, has a wide variety of sample assessments, required rubrics, and if you're interested in modularized content, if you could send an email to Julie Lindstrom, and her contact information is included, and Julie is here. Thank you, Julie. For access to that content. So I'm going to stop sharing and hopefully find you all again. Hello. So what I'd like to do before we go into groups is just generally talk about any questions that have bubbled up, or, oh, I think this might work at our institution, or, oh, I see this as a potential challenge for this aspect of reconstruction. So any comments or questions, things people want to share?
Jonna, one thing that came up at the Community of Practice curriculum meeting that I wanted to bring to this meeting, and it's a really deep conversation I think we need to have maybe even, you know what I mean, that gets its own. So the one thing that I wanted to confirm, and I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, but I don't want to assume, the NACI crosswalk that you're showing a link to is aligned to the 2021 standards, not the 2010 standards, correct? So that's the most updated crosswalk. Amazing, because I know some of us are straddling in between for that. And I think this is actually summer is the last time you could possibly be. You have to be using new standards for self-study from that point forward. The other thing is that I kind of started, I didn't spend a ton of time doing it, but I started digging into that crosswalk. And what's going to be really tricky about modularization for that crosswalk is that the way that the crosswalk works, and of course, because they see competencies weren't designed in the same way that the gateways competencies were, is that it neither aligns by level nor by subject area. Right. So there would be no way to bundle like an early childhood level 2 into one key assessment that would be NACI compliant, nor is there a way to have like a, not impossible, but I would say the way that when I started pulling it apart, I was like, woof, it would be really hard to maintain the requirements for the way key assessments need to be designed by NACI and also maintain using one of those key assessments as assessments of competencies.
So I think that's such an interesting and important point. And one thing I'll say, and Tony, you can chime in, correct me, but there are two versions of those, that NACI alignment. And one is kind of a vertical alignment by competency. But the other, and the other was suggested by one of our committee members. It was so, I thought, such a fabulous and great suggestion, but it was one of those that required kind of a unthinking of things, right? When you're reorganizing it. And in that version, it is, I believe, aligned by content area. Tony, do you remember? So there are two versions, and in one of them, I think it would be more responsive to your point, but I think there's opportunity for a little more around that in terms of alignment as you're raising. Tony, do you?
My memory of this is that we took the NACI competencies as learning and behavior descriptors, and connected them, aligned them with the gateways competencies. But then we also went back and mapped the gateways competencies to each of the NACI competencies to be able to show where that was. And that, I guess that would be the content area kind of connection, because the NACI standards are not necessarily, they're not leveled in the same way that the gateways are leveled, although the content areas are pretty much in alignment with each other. There's not a big difference between their content and the gateways content. So we could align the gateways competencies with the NACI competencies, but you wouldn't necessarily, you would see like multiple levels within each of those content areas. It wasn't like a clear-cut leveling type of thing.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. That was helpful. So you're right, Leslie, that you need to measure each key element. For data collection purposes, yes. So I think, and I'll spend some time on this, because I think we were able just to extract and organize around our assessments. However, I'll spend some time on what that might look like, what exactly and what potential obstacles are in terms of just going straight from the alignment, right? Yeah, I think that's an important question. And Stephanie, thank you for sharing. Does that have both the kind of accordion on that link? I'm going to click on it really quick.
I'm double checking to see if it does.
Yeah, because there are two versions, and it's possible the other version. I mean, the second version is like possibly 50 pages long, and I think it gets to what you're talking about, Leslie, in a more organized way, but I want to confirm that. Other kind of things that would be beneficial to clarify as the larger group before we go into small groups. Okay, so if I'm thinking maybe 2 groups, and the idea of just spending maybe 15 minutes talking about, okay, this is what I think will work. This is what, I'm still struggling with. I think the opportunity to kind of percolate together is beneficial. And then we can kind of debrief as a broader group and see what other kinds of investigations might be beneficial. So is everybody comfortable with that? We'll go break into small groups. I see a couple people have to leave. So take care, Kathy, take care, Erica. So we'll just go into 2 small groups. Thanks, Stephanie. And I'm just,
you want me to stay here in this main session, and then if anybody needs anything, I can push them through, or would you like me to join a room?
Whatever you'd like to do.
Okay.
Just, yeah. I'll be interested in seeing where everybody, okay. Thank you. Raise that with Joni. I just finished my sentence. So, how was your discussion? And, right before, Leslie, you had mentioned things that had happened at the ECA's forum last week and so I'd love to hear other connecting points for that. We have a couple questions for you, Tony, from our group. But sharing discussion, how did your small group go? Discourse within it, things that came up? Melissa, you look like you were going to say something. Was I wrong?
I always have something to say, but I work on trying to also be a listener. One of the things that I talked about that has been an added challenge is that when we have multiple credentials, so not just ECE, but we have infant toddler and we have director credential, and we do our best to have, some separate, we have courses dedicated for the infant toddler credential, and we have ones for director. But I was talking about our assessment class. An assessment is kind of cut across all of those different, and so we have some of those lower level assessment credentials from across the credentials, assessment competencies from across credentials in our assessment class, because they all kind of get at those assessment pieces. So figuring out how do I modularize this, not just within the context of like the ECE credential, but I've also got these other components. How do I make this all fit together has been a big puzzle. When I was saying it's like a big puzzle trying to figure out how do these pieces fit together.
Yeah, I think in some cases, and this was one of the discussion points that we had, at Heartland, we did not modularize every single course. We picked the ones that were, connected to level 2, and we thought would be the biggest kind of support for a variety of reasons, including most specifically the incumbent workforce. But there might be reasons why you think this is not a course that I would elect to modularize. These are what I'm going to prioritize. That idea of what is a pressing reason or rationale. There might be pressing reasons to modularize or not to, So yeah, I think and that's something to kind of revisit, engage in. Other comments? I wanted to share one comment that there were several just really important points of discussion that came up in our group. And one you touched on as well, Melissa, like when we have other competencies embedded from other credentials. And so, we focused on level 2, and we have ITC level 2 competencies blended in. And so since they, mapped to the parent course, we were okay. But, you know, thinking of that kind of blended or substrata is so important. But one point I wanted to share that I thought was just like powerful is the idea that, you know, it's not a curriculum redesign. It's more of a reorganization and, you know, of content that we already have. And there are a variety of different supports that could be beneficial as you're looking at your curriculum. One that was specifically mentioned related to the modularized content. And so really thinking about it in what components can we redesign for a very powerful impact. And Tony, related to that, one of the issues that came up, and I was like, oh, Tony's with the IBHE now. The idea of coordination across systems. You know, we've been really kind of drawing from IAI as a, you know, kind of continuous touch point, but the idea that if it's redesign or reorganization without this broader kind of continuity across the system, we can continue to perpetuate that example slide I gave, where here's 4 courses, it's the same course, it all transfers as 3 credit hours, and it's all got all this disparate. And so the importance of that kind of continuity across our systems to really support the learner in transfer and articulation, which I know is something you're so focused on, but I thought it was an important connection.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I just got off a webinar on IAI through IBHE talking about the more recent changes to IAI. And early childhood is a part of IAI in the sense of being a major that has courses in the major that are identified for transfer. But so here's my thinking. IAI works beautifully for AA and AAS transfers who are carrying a lot of general education and can do the gen ed package and then have 4 courses in the major, maybe, or 1 to 4 courses in the major that can transfer. But how does it work for the AAS? And so the AAS, which is so heavy in the major and so light in the gen ed transfer, is really where we need to be thinking about modularization, because I think what typically happens is that you may have the 4 courses that will come across as transfer, boom, you don't have to worry about that. But then there are multiple other courses that AAS students take in methods, in infants and toddlers, in other areas that don't necessarily have a clear equivalency with the 4-year institution. And so then what happens with those courses? They end up getting turned into general electives, and they are transferred as general electives, but then your transfer student ends up repeating some of the content and skills that they have done at the 2-year institution, at the 4-year institution, because they are taking courses that include that content and skills. It hasn't been teased out. It hasn't been removed. It is, my best example is a methods class, right? Where at the 2-year school, you have at the 2-year institution, you have preschool math methods, okay, or preschool literacy. And at the 4-year institution, you have preschool and primary literacy, preschool and primary math. And so because that preschool methods class is not equivalent to a preschool and primary methods class, the preschool methods class gets treated as an elective, and then the student takes the preschool and primary methods class and repeats that content. And what happens then, as it goes on, is that having taken those courses as electives eats up their credit hours, that they are going to need for graduation, right? Because they're counted. And so they don't do the bilingual ESL endorsement, or they don't do the infant toddler credential, or they don't do the Illinois director credential because they are repeating that coursework. So in my mind, this is where you modularize. At the very least, you split apart your preschool and your primary methods. But if you don't do that, then you can start to look at how you modularize that course. So you can say, I'm going to give you the credit for the preschool methods, and you only need to do the primary methods.
So I agree with it. So it's that alignment on competencies, right? And so we have right now, we have 2 additional courses that we can put through in IAI to hit kind of the max. And we have 12 competencies that are embedded in 2 of the courses. And the competencies are listed, alignment on those syllabi are listed as optional to align to them. But the idea of, if we're thinking about system and undergoing this, work in a meaningful way where everything is articulated across all of the components of the system. And Leslie or April, I'm not sure which of you brought this up, but the idea that it would be alignment to competencies within, as opposed to, we've sort of got these competencies and you could maybe align this way, but really thinking of it in a systematic way.
What Leslie is doing, what they're doing at NLU avoids this issue that I am talking about, because they are looking purely at competencies and competency levels. So they say, if you come in with up to, I don't have to, if I'm misquoting you, Leslie, jump in and say it. You've got up to level 4. Now we're only going to do level 5. And whatever those courses are based on level 5 competencies. But that is not necessarily the case in the run-of-the-mill 4-year early childhood program.
And we don't have an IAI system that encourages. And, I'll mention one thing somebody mentioned, I think it was you, Tony, talking about the AA pathway, the AAS. One of the things that we did at Heartland was we mapped competencies to, like, the exceptional child, which is an IAI course. So,
right.
So that they'd be recognized if they were on the AA path. But at the system level, that kind of pathway development that NLU is engaged in, that Heartland's been engaged in, that, many of you are engaged in, isn't necessarily reflective. I think if we put a little bit more concrete option there, it would kind of propagate some additional, unique paths amongst institutions. So.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, Tony. That was helpful. Additional points people want to make around this conversation, or others? I'm just glancing at the clock and looking at. Anything else come up in groups that people want to highlight?
Well, one of the things that I will just throw in this is a system issue within institutions, and that is that this is a messy process, and most institutions like efficiency. And they like the idea that you have 25 students who are all in the class and all taking it together, and there does not need to be that kind of breaking it down and individualizing and looking at these pieces. And so there needs to be a discussion at a different level than us to make sure that this work is work that is supported and that has an effect, actually, that you're not spending your summer modularizing your curriculum only to have your dean or provost say, this is not really great. And our students also need to be educated that this is something that is to their benefit, and that it is not, that by individualizing, we're not picking on them, or saying, you have to do something that other people don't have to do, or you're that equity issue, as Melissa put it so beautifully, is something that students have to understand, that this is a student equity issue.
part of that is just a perfect segue to some of what we're going to be talking about at our next gathering, and that includes the key stakeholders. So if you elect to make some changes in modularization, who do you need the support of in terms of, okay, do this, as well as who are the people at your institution that are important levers? And I think that those, those there's people that can support the work is in part position, and I'd also say in part temperament, because there are some people who really like embrace messes and are kind of filled up by it, and there are others, and this is just, I think, a reality, who are like, oh my god, like, what on earth is that that's going to create this and this and this and the other thing. So thinking about who those initial partners are that would support you in making those changes. So we've got a lot on the docket for next time in terms of thinking about the broader institutional system and the contextual system and how all of that interacts in terms of decision making. I have some homework that I've assigned myself to revisit that I will get back to each of you on. Are there any other, and I'll send out materials for this meeting, Stephanie, as well. Thank you. Other questions or comments from this time together? Kira, we see you.
I finally got through at the very end. Sorry.
Well, it's good to see you. Well, I think such like meaty, interesting discussion. And so I'm so looking forward to more. We're off a week. I think it's 3 weeks because of the holiday and then the Build conference, which they're having a strike. So there might not be a Build conference, but that won't influence our gathering for the week after. So yeah, but I will look forward to seeing you all. I hope you're all doing well. And thank you again for just the really kind of meaty figuring this out conversation. I'm grateful for it. So take care, everybody.